This morning, Secretary Rumsfeld will address the complex issues facing U.S. policymakers, including his thoughts on ongoing conflict in Libya, America's role in the broad transformation of the Middle East, and adapting American and international institutions for new global challenges. You have a more comprehensive biography on your chairs, but briefly, Donald Rumsfeld served twice as U.S. Secretary of Defense, first under President Gerald Ford and subsequently under President George W. Bush. Secretary Rumsfeld's career serving the U.S. government has spanned 10 U.S. presidencies and has included positions, among others, as a congressman serving his home district of Winnetka, the U.S. ambassador to NATO, White House Chief of Staff, and Special Presidential Envoy to the Middle East. As Chicagoans, we can take pride in the contribution his high school years at New Trier made to his future success. It was at New Trier that Don became a wrestler. As he says in his memoir, wrestling brought home to him the relationship between effort and results, a relationship, I would venture to say, he never lost sight of, and which served both him and our country well during his distinguished career. Following his remarks and the question and answer session, Secretary Rumsfeld's memoir, Known and Unknown, will be available for purchase and signing just outside the hall. Now, please join me in welcoming Secretary Donald Rumsfeld.
Thank you very much, Marshall, Jim. I appreciate that. I've never seen this where they've got instant feedback where you grade the speaker. I'm not sure I like it. But they also grade the introducer. Then I looked at this little sheet, and I noticed that I'm the opening act for The Naked Economist. Makes you right proud. It really does. The description Jim gave of what I was going to talk about would take, 4 or 5 hours to do it. And I don't have 4 or 5 hours, and nor do you. And so I welcome all of you. Thank you for being here so bright and early. It's wonderful to be back in this great city. I think what I'll do is, let's see, it's 5 after 8. You wind me up at 9 and give me the hook, I'm told, Marshall. What I thought I'd do is talk about a couple of things. The book, it is superb. Pakistan and the complexity there, because I think it's illustrative of what's going on in the world and the problems our leaders face. And then something about the institutions we're living with that are leftovers from the last century and really don't fit the 21st century or the information age. And then all of that in less than 15 minutes, and then respond to questions for as long as you have questions. The book. I'd never written a book, and I'd lived 1/3 of our country's history. That is a long time. And I debated whether to write a book rapidly in a year and do it basically from memory, or whether I should take advantage of this amazing archive I've accumulated over 78 years. I better say 79 years next month, because I know there are people here who know that. And I decided to take 4 years and take advantage of the technology that exists and digitize a good fraction of the... Bob Malott, greetings. Nice to see you. I didn't see you earlier. Greetings. So many old friends here, my goodness. So I took 4 years, digitized a lot of my records. I had my parents' letters back and forth. I was born in 1932. My parents' letters back and forth during World War II, when my dad was on a carrier. When I was a congressman for 4 terms, it was during the Vietnam and Civil Rights era, which was a tough era in our country, and a lot of controversy in the city of Washington, and several other cities burned when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And During the Vietnam War, President Johnson couldn't get outside of his White House. They put buses around it to keep people from breaking in. It was a hostile time, and I dictated a note after every vote that I cast in Congress, and I had that interesting record. When I served in the Nixon administration and then for Gerald Ford, and with Gerald Ford, he'd never been elected president or vice president. And I would go into him in the morning when I chaired his transition and then served as chief of staff in the White House and unload 10 or 15 things, and then he would unload 10 or 15 things he'd accumulated. I'd race out and dictate it. And my secretary would type it up, and then my young assistant, Dick Cheney, would go do it. And I have those notes. They've never been edited. They've never been polished. The spelling's all wrong, but they were a working document to see that the White House functioned. And to have all of that from that amazing period of time where he succeeded the only president in our history who had to resign. And then they tell me when I was at the Pentagon the last time, I dictated something like 20,000 memos. So that, once digitized, enabled us to produce a book that has been described as the first memoir of the 21st century, of the information age. They created a website to go with it, rumsfeld.com, where if you go in the book and see a paragraph that I quote out of a memo, you can then go to the website and see the entire memo. So a person who wants to really get a sense of how decisions are made and the reality that if it looks confused sometime, it's only because it is. The fact that you have to make decisions, as people in this room know well, with imperfect information, incomplete information, sometimes even inaccurate information. And I think that people who are interested in how government works will have a chance to read the memos and get a sense of what was actually taking place. Most of the books that are written about people in government tend to be written by journalists. They tend to be written by people who were not there, who were not involved in that process. They often get written by people whose sources are 2 or 3 layers down. And they also get written by people who want to sell books. And so they become dramatic. They take differences of view and lower them down into differences of personalities and clashes between great personalities. And you think back, you've had George Shultz's differences with Cap Weinberger and Brzezinski's differences with Cy Vance and Kissinger's differences with Bill Rogers or Jim Schlesinger. And you get the impression that what's going on in there is the clash of titans, people who are just basically disagreeing with each other. And of course, it isn't like that. Understandably, there are differences of opinion, differences of view, and they're discussed and debated, as they should be. And they are generally not personal in any way. So I've tried to convey that in the book. I'm not an expert on the new media, but I'm told the book, which came out February 8th, the website has had something like 16.5 million hits since February 8th. Now, I don't know if that's a lot, but it sure sounds like a lot to me. And it pleases me greatly because it took time, it was expensive, and it indicates that there are people out there who want to go in and look at the actual documentation and come away with a sense of what really took place. The proceeds of the book, not the publisher's proceeds, but my proceeds from the book are going to support the military charities that our foundation supports, to support the troops and their families and the children of those who've fallen. So I'd really appreciate it if those of you who bought a book go stop by and bite 4 or 5 more on your way out. It's a good cause. The book's been on the New York Times bestseller list for a number of weeks, which you know has to drive the New York Times people nuts. Now, Pakistan. If you think of what you're reading in the press, you're seeing things like congressmen are preparing to end aid to Pakistan. Pakistan refuses to give helicopter back, may show it to China. The enemy is in Pakistan. The unraveling of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Tolerance for Pakistan's double dealing must end. That's basically the tone of what we've seen ever since the raid which successfully killed Osama bin Laden. You also see things, how in the world could the world's #1 terrorist, the face of al-Qaeda, be sitting in comfort a mile or two from a major Pakistani military base? Obviously, they had to know. My view is, go drive up Sheridan Road. Look at some of those estates and the walls and the gates. You don't know what's going on in there. I don't know what's going on in there. If I were OBL, I wouldn't have told anyone in the Pakistan government where I was. You tell one other person and your risk of having it known and getting caught increases dramatically, geometrically, because they're going to tell somebody else also. So personally, it's not clear to me that anyone in the Pakistan government knew where he was. That is very counter to what seems logical. But I believe that. And I think we ought to ask the tough questions. Don't get me wrong. But I think to jump to judgment immediately and assume that he had to be known to the Pakistani government, I think is probably a mistake to jump to that conclusion. Second, the contention that Pakistan is not dealing straight with us and that therefore we should sever relations and cut off any assistance we're providing them. You know, that would make you feel good for about 5 minutes. And then you'd look and say, well, where are we? And what you've got is a Muslim country with a lot of radicals, with people in the intelligence agency, the ISI, who clearly for years supported the Taliban. Pakistan was one of the only 3 countries in the world that had diplomatic relationships with Afghanistan's Taliban leadership back then. And unquestionably, al-Qaeda has been hiding in the federally administered tribal areas up north, the so-called Fatah, and the Pakistanis haven't done much. Now, let's examine that for a minute. The extremists, there are madrasas in Pakistan that are radical and teaching people to go out and kill people. There's no question about that. When Musharraf was there, they tried to kill him 3 or 4 times. So he understood the threat. The situation in that country was that they were doing basically not a bad job collecting up terrorists in urban areas outside of the Fatah. In the Fatah, they were not doing a good job. They sent people up there and they had hundreds killed. Why didn't they do well up there? It's an ungoverned area. They don't control it. There are ungoverned areas all around the world, and they're very hospitable for terrorists and for al-Qaeda. And so we look at it and we say, well, my goodness, we know there's terrorists up there, and the line between Pakistan and Afghanistan really doesn't even exist. These tribes cross back and forth all the time. They're the same friends and relatives. And the idea that it's some neat situation where they could control it if they wanted to seems to me is a reach. Then you go back in history and you say to yourself, well, what did we do with Pakistan before? I think it was in the 1980s. There was a senator named Pressler. He offered an amendment after they exploded a nuclear weapon, and we severed relationships with them. Made us feel terrific. And what happened? We went through, 20 years, a whole generation, with no military-to-military contact between the United States and the Pakistan military. Harmful. Not helpful at all. Comes 9/11, we go over and talk to Musharraf, and here he is in a nuclear country, Muslim country, worried about India and Kashmir, and he stands up and agrees to help us in putting pressure on terrorists. Enormous help. Base opportunities where we can fly out of there, transit across the country to get into a landlocked country in Afghanistan. The advantage that we gained from the relationship that Musharraf, at his risk, stood up and provided the United States of America was enormous. We could cut off aid. We could sever relations. We could say they're not perfect. They're not like we are. In fact, we said that. We told them, no, I didn't, but someone in our government said, gee, Musharraf is wearing a uniform, and that's not a good idea. He ought to take his uniform off. So he took his uniform off, and he got tossed out of office. Are we better off today with the governments than there? I think not. I don't think that's an impressive government. Musharraf, the idea that everyone in the world ought to behave like we do, it seems to me, is not rational. Other countries aren't like we are. They have different histories, different cultures, different neighbors. We aren't like we used to be. We still had slaves into the 1800s. Women didn't vote into the 1900s. We had a bloody civil war, lost hundreds of thousands of our citizens. So we've been changing, and they change and evolve over time. And it seems to me that it's dangerous if we look around the world and say, oh, we can't deal with that country, they're corrupt. Well, my goodness, isn't that amazing? There's gambling in the casino. We have congressmen that go to jail. What, about every 3 or 4 years somebody gets put in the slammer? Of course there's corruption. There's corruption in most every country in the world. Probably least here. But being judgmental about it and saying we're not going to deal with people that aren't like us, that aren't like the way we are today, you can't do that. We can't function in this world. We've got political interest, security interest, and economic interest. And they need to be balanced. And you can't simply say, in my view, you can't simply say that in every instance, this particular interest trumps that interest. We have to be not uncomfortable. You may not like it, but you have to be not uncomfortable dealing with countries and recognizing that they will cooperate with us in some ways and maybe not in other ways. And I worry that this counter-charge on Pakistan, I was pleased to see Senator Kerry was over there talking to him, and he was using very measured language and thoughtful language that reflects the complexity of the relationship we've got with Pakistan, and I would submit also reflects the reality that they bring a lot to our needs with respect to cooperating. We can't solve most of the problems we face in the world. We can't solve by ourselves. We have to work with other countries, and clearly you have to do that. You've got to accept the fact that they'll cooperate with us in some ways, but maybe not in every way. And in some instances, their cooperation may be imperfect. And we have to decide how do we feel about that. And my view is that we need a balanced, thoughtful approach. You know, we did the same thing with Indonesia years back, another large Muslim country. And we decided that, I guess it was their police force, was behaving in a way that we found inconsistent with our values. So we severed relationships, all military to military relationships with Indonesia. Where did it leave us? You end up with a whole generation of Indonesians and military and U.S. military not knowing each other, not connected, not transferring our concepts of civilian control over the military to the other countries. So I mention that because I think it's an example of something that we need to be thoughtful about and not simply react in a way that satisfies us and makes us feel good for a few minutes because we've taken the moral high ground. The moral high ground. I mean, what did Winston Churchill say? He ended up working with Joseph Stalin, a butcher, if there ever was one, because he wanted to defeat Nazi Germany. Did he like Stalin? No. Did he agree with the way Stalin behaved? No. But was he willing to cooperate and provide a relationship that was helpful to his principal goal of defeating Nazi Germany? And I think few no one would have liked to have to deal with Stalin, but I think few people today, in retrospect, would think that the United States and or Great Britain made a mistake in dealing with Stalin. I think they did the right thing. Last, before I, oh my goodness, let me just quickly make a comment. The Truman administration, end of World War II, beginning of the Cold War, an inflection point in the United States. Most of the institutions that we have in the world today were fashioned during that period. In the United States, that was the National Security Act, National Security Council, Department of Defense, CIA, USIA, all of those things were during that period. Internationally, we had the United Nations, NATO, the IMF, the World Bank. Those institutions were fashioned during that same period. Now we go through, 50 years where we live with those institutions and things evolve, and we come into the 21st century, the Cold War ends, and we're at another inflection point, the beginning of the information age. But we still have basically the same institutions. And they're creaky. They're basically 8-hour-day institutions. They have not been adjusted and revised and streamlined and to recognize the reality that it's a different era, it's a different century, it's a different age. And it strikes me that we're at a point where we need to acknowledge that reality and begin to take a look at some of them and see if we can't bring them into the 21st century, into the information age. There are lots of reasons I say that. I've seen the grinding of gears, and I write about this in the book. The grinding of gears when these institutions come up and then they come up straight in stovepipes, and you have to try to bend them at the top so the threads come through the needlehead in a reasonably rational way. Because no one problem is distinctively ours, because the problems we face require many nations to cooperate, whether it's piracy or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction or terror. Those things are the kinds of things one country can't deal with alone. And no one problem at home is distinctively Department of Defense or Department of State or intelligence. They all tend to be problems that need to be looked at in a broader way. So with that, my recommendation would be that we have something like a Hoover Commission that looked at government and its organization and the arrangements and get a bipartisan group of people and let them invest some time and think about how we can do a much better job. The problem is very tough, and the reason it's tough is because of the Congress. You've got all these committees and subcommittees and people who get seniority and they become ranking member or chairman, and they've got their piece of turf. And they want to control that piece of turf. And they don't want to see rational solutions take place among departments and agencies in the executive branch because it diminishes their authority, their decision-making ability. So you've got in the Defense Department, you've got the Iron Triangle, you've got the permanent Congress and the permanent industry and the permanent bureaucracy in the department, and they get together and they like the way things are. And if we don't recognize that we need to keep transforming ourselves and fitting ourselves into the new century and into the information age, then we'll be making a lot of mistakes we don't need to be making. With that, I'll stop and be happy to respond to questions. Marshall, are you going to take the questions? And I answer them, huh?
Yes, sir.
I'll try.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's wonderful to hear someone of your extraordinary experience ask us to think about how we transform ourselves for the rest of this century. So, particularly taken by your last remarks. The floor is open for your questions. Usual council rules apply. Once I recognize you, please wait until the microphone reaches you. State your name and your question briefly. I will interrupt you. I will cut you off if it goes on. Just fair warning. It's open. The lady here, please.
I never like the first question. When that hand shoots up, you know they've got something on their mind. It's burning a hole in their pocket.
Hello.
It's okay. Go ahead, please.
Karen Kane.
Hold the mic close, please.
Karen Kane, as a former congressman, how would you advise that Congress transform itself?
You know, I'm plucky, but I'm not stupid. that is asking the impossible. It's untransformable, I think. No, they're not going to make a lot of changes, but if we can get them to behave differently with respect to the executive branch, I think we would be making great strides. I mean, it is the desire on individual members of Congress to do well and do right is a serious one, and that's to be respected. And I valued my time in Congress. But the perspective one has from the legislative branch is so totally different than from the executive branch or from overseas, looking back at the United States. I was floored. I had no... I literally, when I was a member of Congress, I'd studied government. I'd worked on Capitol Hill as an assistant. I'd served in Congress for 4 terms. There was not a doubt in my mind but that I had a good sense of the executive branch of the federal government. I resigned from Congress, went in the executive branch, and I thought, oh my goodness, Don, you were so wrong. You just didn't get it. I ended up writing 2 letters of apologies to people that I had not handled the way I would have liked to have handled them had I had the knowledge in the executive branch that I thought I had when I was in the legislative branch. So I don't know what the solution is. You know, where you stand depends on where you sit, and that's tough. It's hard. I don't have any answer.
This gentleman here, please.
We went after, with great success, Osama bin Laden, but we're not going after Gaddafi. If you were still in the administration, what rule or rules would you apply to these kinds of actions?
It seems to me what's important in that part of the world is Iran going for nuclear weapons and Syria, which is both causing us difficulty in Afghanistan and Iraq, feeding Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that's very important. Also important are Egypt, 60 million people, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Less so Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, just realistically, if you're looking at our strategic interests. On the other hand, once the United States of America is engaged, and we are engaged in Libya, then what we have to realize that everything we do there is judged and has an effect anywhere in the world, everywhere in the world. So I don't see how, once you've gotten involved in Libya, you can leave Gaddafi there. I think the signal from that is a terrible one. What's that mean? What do you do about that? You think of a table with magnetic particles and a magnet, and you move the magnet, and all the particles go like this, and then they go this way. And it seems to me that people ask me, well, why didn't the administration go to Congress and ask for authority? Instead, they went to the UN and NATO and so forth. And I said, the reason they didn't go to the Congress, they didn't know what to ask for. They'd not established a clear, unambiguous mission. And in my view, the mission determines the coalition. You decide what do you want to do, and then you fashion countries that can do that, that agree with that general mission. The coalition ought not to try to fashion a mission, because it's too late then. And we went and organized a coalition before the mission had clarity. And my personal view is that the ambiguity and lack of clarity about what the NATO countries were doing in there is the only reason Gaddafi's still there. The magnetic particles, if it were clear that Gaddafi is not going to be there when it's over, then, you know, the corporal in the army is going to say, well, I'm going to shift over. The ambassador is going to resign. Government workers, someone who wants some intelligence or some food for the rebels, they're going to be more cooperative. They're going to start tilting away from Gaddafi. At the moment, there's still a very good chance that a guy who's been there for 40 years, is perfectly willing to be repressive, is going to be there for another 30. And people are not doing what they would naturally do, turn away from him he would be gone, in my view, if there had been clarity that that was the purpose. And I think there's still time.
Going to go to the back of the room, the gentleman on the aisle. Yes, please.
Thank you for being
It's
here, Mr.
working. Hold it
Secretary.
close to your mouth. Yeah.
I would like to know, what do you believe are the limits to the president's war powers under the Constitution?
Well, you're asking a law school dropout. And I don't know that I'm the one to answer that, but we've had presidents of both political parties over my adult lifetime. In some instances go to Congress, rare instances go to Congress for a declaration of war. In other instances go for a resolution of some kind, and in a number of instances not go to Congress for anything. And there's ambiguity about it. There was some legislation passed that has never been tested in the court, and presidents have kind of paid lip service to it, and no one seems to want to test it in the court. But I think that what it is what the courts and the legislative body seem to accept, and what the society seems to accept. And the idea of a clear, crisp declaration of war is something that is probably less likely, one would hope, in the period going forward because of the nature of the world and the fact that you don't have a big margin for error. Let me give you an example. We lost 3,000 people on 9/11. Johns Hopkins did a study where they postulated smallpox in 3 locations in the United States, and within less than a year, 1 million Americans were dead in this study. Now, if weapons are increasingly lethal, presidents don't have a big margin for error to engage in a lengthy arrangement with Congress about what to do about something, and indeed the very process might be not only not permit the kind of time it would take, but also might require disclosing things that would be unfortunate to disclose in terms of the president or the executive branch's ability to deal with a problem. So I think it's something that's evolved over time. We know what the words are. We know what the hope is. And presidents have done it, as I say, in some instances with a clear declaration of war. In other instances, they've gotten cooperation from the senior leadership in Congress and developed understandings. In other instances, they've gone ahead and acted where they believed it was in the national interest and then gone to Congress after that. So if I'd finished law school, maybe I could have done a better job.
Mr. Secretary, I wonder if I could step in here with a question. You spent much of your time, Secretary, under President Bush, thinking about and working on the restructuring of the U.S. military in very forward-looking ways. And I wonder if you'd give us an assessment of where that effort stands in your view and how it's been affected by recent developments and the upcoming budget cuts.
President Bush, as governor, gave a speech at the Citadel and said he wanted to bring the Department of Defense into the 21st century. He asked me to do that. I set about the task. 9/11 came along, and there were a lot of people who thought, well, that's going to derail any process of transforming the department. In fact, it didn't derail it. It provided impetus to it. What we've done, I'll just take 3 or 4 or 5 things real quickly. We repositioned our forces around the world so that they no longer look like a leftover from the Cold War or World War II. We positioned them in a much better way so we don't require a lot of approval from other countries' parliaments to move them. We have them in large measure in places where that is hospitable to their being there, where people want them. We have them in places where we can move them fairly rapidly. Second, probably the biggest single transforming thing that took place, thanks to Chief of Staff of the Army, Pete Schoomaker, we've been functioning with divisions in the Army, and they were proud divisions with great histories and banners and history books and songs. And if you took an element from a division and moved it someplace, you had to take this combat support and combat support and move it with it, leaving the rest of the division naked and not functional. We moved to brigade combat teams, which are modular, have the combat support they need, can be moved, and do not in any way degrade the capability. There's no way we could be doing what we're doing in the world today if we were still functioning under the division structure. We knew that because of the strength of our armies, navies, and air forces, that they acted as a major deterrent, and that we were less likely to be attacked in a conventional way and more likely to have the enemy's brain figure out that they ought to go after us in an unconventional way, an asymmetrical way. We increased the budget of the Special Operation Forces 2 or 3 times. We increased the numbers of special operators by 50%. We improved their equipment. We gave them additional authority. We brought the Marine Corps kicking and screaming into the special operations world with MARSOC. And the capability of the United States to deal with unconventional, asymmetric threats because of the enormous skill and training of these people is so different today than it was in 2001. The Air Forces love airplanes. I was a Navy pilot, and a lot of people in here were, and you liked manned aircraft. So the idea that you could take money from manned aircraft and stick it into unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, Predators and Global Hawks and that type of thing, is painful. You really have trouble getting the military to let you do that. We did it. We've dramatically increased our capability of unmanned aerial vehicles. We would not even begin to be able to do what we're doing today if we hadn't really given a shot to that capability to the benefit of the country. So those are the kinds of things. One other thing we did that didn't work out is we have hundreds of thousands of civilian personnel in the Department of Defense, and we had multiple personnel systems, and we did the stunningly outrageous thing of trying to create pay for performance. And we got through the Congress, the National Security Personnel Act, put it in place, and what was happening was not complicated. The civilian personnel system was so complicated that they couldn't hire anyone fast, they couldn't fire anyone fast, even slow, and so what would you do? You'd do the logical thing. If you had a job to do in the Department of Defense, you'd go to either the military because you could bring them in, give them a job, send them away when it was over, or you'd go to a contractor because you could bring them in, have them do the job, or send them away. You would not use the civilian personnel system. So we put in the National Security Personnel System. I left the Pentagon, and within a year, the unions in the White House and the Congress rolled it back and ended pay for performance and reimposed the kind of structures and strictures on how they behave, and it's a darn shame.
Thank you. Going to go in the back, the gentleman with the blue shirt, please. Yes.
Eugene Bold, Iraq. Do you have any regrets?
Oh my goodness, sure. You wish it would take in 5 minutes. The president made a decision to go in. The Congress in the 1990s, Democratic Congress, had passed the regime change legislation. President Bill Clinton signed the legislation. When I arrived, the Iraqis were shooting at our aircraft almost every day. 2,000 times they shot at our aircraft as the United States and the UK patrolled the no-fly zones in the south and the north of Iraq. And we knew we were going to end up with a plane getting shot down or people being killed or captured. And the major combat operations went well. The post-major combat operations did not go well, and you ended up with an insurgency that evolved. I suppose it started with the 100,000 criminals that Saddam Hussein let out of the prisons, which had not been anticipated. Then the second thing that happened is the army disbanded itself. It had, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Sunni generals, and then a lot of Shia conscripts. And the conscripts just threw down their weapons when they saw the U.S. military come in, the coalition military, and went home. And you ended up with a lot of young men without jobs, some of them with weapons. and they became recruits for insurgency. The Sunnis had controlled the country, and they didn't like the idea of a Shia majority. And so they stood back, and the first part of the insurgency were Saddamists, who were formed what they called the Party of Return. They were going to take back the government away from the Shias. And so you ended up with an insurgency, and an insurgency is an ugly thing, history. We know how long they take, we know how tough they are, and that's been unfortunate. A certain combination of things have helped, starting in 2005 and 2006. The Sunnis decided that they didn't like al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was raping their families and taking their businesses, and they started pulling away, and we had what was called the awakening. The second thing, the Maliki government developed some maturity finally, the Iraqi government. The period in there led to Sadr, for whatever reason, the Shia cleric, so-called cleric, ended up going quiet. Instead of putting his, what he called the Saudi army, which wasn't an army at all, but instead of putting him out in the street and causing troubles, he either went to Iran or he went quiet. And so a series of things happened that made it better. But our intelligence had not anticipated the insurgency at all. But no, a war is just a terrible, terrible thing. It's a god-awful thing, and wonderful people get killed, and no one can be involved in that and not just feel heartbroken about seeing things that don't go as well as one would want, because they're such uncertain problems.
On that note, Mr. Secretary, could we ask you about Afghanistan?
You're going to start asking me if you can ask me?
I'm asking you about Afghanistan.
Do it.
What should we do?
Well, the first thing we ought to do is stop picking on Karzai. He was elected. He's the man there, and people point and say, "Oh, there's corruption there." And I mean, he's not corrupt in my view. Maybe someone in his family is. Maybe some people around him are. There's corruption in a lot of governments, but he's there. He's doing it. He was picked by those people. And you remember in the Vietnam War how the Kennedy administration started beating up on Diem, and he ended up getting killed, and what came after him wasn't as good? You know, he was going to tear down what is darn well better have something better. And I haven't seen anything better. And to have Holbrooke and Jim Jones and Eikenberry go beating up on Karzai and weakening him, it seems to me, is not smart. We want to have him do well for that country. Now, what about that? Well, my view of it is we have, on my website, I wrote a thing before 9/11 called Guidelines for Using Military Force. And one of the points I made in there is you better have a healthy respect for the things we can't do. We can't do everything. And we ought to know that we can't do everything. And that's a tribal country. They have bad neighbors. They're landlocked. They had a drought. They were occupied by the Soviets for, 10 years? The Taliban was a terribly vicious government, using the soccer stadiums to cut off people's heads instead of play soccer. Now, what do you do about it? Well, I think what you do is don't think you can turn it into a modern-day democracy. It's going to be different. Give it a chance. Encourage it. Wish it well. But you can't make a career out of it. And you can't turn it into a country that's comfortable with central government, in my view. They're still going to be tribal, and that's okay. If you ask, if the ditch needs to be built, an American's going to get a shovel and dig a darn good ditch. The problem is, if you need 1 million ditches, you need other people digging the ditches. And you darn well better be willing to accept that the ditch is not going to look like a ditch dug by an American. It's going to be dug by someone else. And that's okay. My feeling is we went in there, did a good job, got the Taliban out. got the Al-Qaeda pushed away, killed and captured a lot of terrorists, and given them a chance, given them an opportunity. And I think that I worry that Petraeus is leaving there, frankly. I think the man who's replacing him is able, but I worry about musical chairs. You now have 5 or 6, 7 battlefield commanders in Afghanistan in 7 or 8 or 9 years. And same thing at CIA. You've got 5 or 6 CIA directors in the last 7 or 8 years. The average tenure is about, what, 18 months, 22 months? You know, if you people ran your businesses like that, you'd go broke. You can't do that. You can't have that kind of turnover. Relationships are important. And the ambassador going in there in Afghanistan is terrific. Ryan Crocker, he's probably one of the best ambassadors we have. And the general is going to replace Petraeus is fine. And Petraeus is a fine man for CIA, but my gosh, Panetta just got there. I'd like to see us have people be there long enough to make some mistakes, see the mistakes, straighten them out, develop some relationships, and then urge people on. We've given you a good opportunity, and we wish you well, and we want to be around to help, but we're not going to stay there forever.
Let me see. Okay, well, I'm going to go to the woman in the middle of the row, please.
Thank you.
Put it close to your mouth.
Thank you. I'm Catherine Hagerman. I thank you for your talk. On the subject of Cold War institutions, I'm wondering if you could share your views about the relevance and the role of NATO in the 21st century. Thank you.
NATO. If you look down from Mars on Earth, there are a handful of countries that have roughly the same values and approaches, free political systems, free economic systems. A large fraction of them happen to be in NATO. There's others, there's South Korea and Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and some others, but not a lot of others. If I'm right, that the problems we face require working with other countries in coalitions that are focused and countries that are interested in that same mission, then it'd be a shame not to have NATO. I mean, NATO is there. And NATO has functioned not badly when the United States provided leadership and when the United States was right. In other words, our judgment was right, and we provided leadership, and we gave them time to kind of come around. It is not an organization that's quick response. It's not an organization that is likely to do much absent good, strong U.S. leadership. I'm not a fan of leading from behind. The concept that apparently was articulated by someone in the White House recently. I think that in the case of an institution like NATO, we have to recognize that when I was ambassador to NATO, there were only 15 countries, 14 in the military command and France, which is in the political side. Today there's, what, 26, 27? And that's more complex. I think what NATO ought to do is get up in the morning and say, look, the problems we're going to want to wrestle with are not going to be likely to be inside the NATO treaty area. They're likely to be outside the NATO treaty area. Second, what we ought to do is to develop relationships, not memberships, but relationships, linkages with countries like Japan and Singapore and South Korea and the like. We're doing that a little bit in NATO with what's called Partnership for Peace, where we've got a number of countries that are not in NATO, that are former Soviet satellites or republics, and beginning to develop military-to-military linkages with them, which is a good thing. But I think that NATO has to face up to the reality that whatever it's going to do of value is going to probably be outside the NATO treaty area, A, and B is going to require that they have linkages with other countries because the reach of the NATO countries is not sufficient for the problems and challenges it's facing. Let me just take piracy, for example.
This is our last question. The gentleman way in the back of the room, please.
Thank you for being here today. My question for you is, some of your greatest accomplishments have been caused to the most horrible human suffering. For example, 1 million dead in Iraq, aspartame, What do you say to that? How do you live with the 1 million who've been killed, or the thousands of U.S. citizens, and the aspartame that you legalized? What do you say to that, sir?
Well, you know, I'm glad you brought up aspartame. I'm not a scientist, and I didn't legalize aspartame. Aspartame is 2 amino acids. It was discovered by a man in a pharmaceutical company in the United States. It went before the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration approved it. They then started studying. They then stayed the approval, studied it, and then lifted the stay. And it's now in, thousands of products all over the globe. And it's been approved by the scientific leadership in almost every country in the world. The fact of the matter is that it is the most studied food additive, I think, in history. And to suggest, as you did, that it is hurting people is factually inaccurate. It's part of what you can find on the internet in terms of conspiracy theories. And it's almost amusing, but it's unfortunate because some people like you actually believe stuff like that.
Please sit down, sir. You had your question. Please sit down. Please sit down. Please sit down, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave the room. Okay. Yes. Okay, we have actually time for one more. I'm going to have one here.
I think I'm going to count him as undecided.
I have to give Bob Malata the last question. It's coming to you, Bob. Hold it up close, Bob. It'll be all right. It's on.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Don, I wondered, in light of all the discussion taking place a bit late in terms of the magnitude of the debt we are about to incur and the resulting discussion on cutting expenses, what would you recommend the Defense Department be cut? How much do you think we can afford to cut defense?
Well, in my lifetime, we've seen 3 times at least three, when a war ended, World War II, we breathed a sigh of relief, cut the defense budget. Next thing you know, Korean War. And you're sorry you cut the defense budget. Then Korean War ends, and same thing. And then the Vietnam War ends, and same thing. Everyone relaxes. And then at the end of the Cold War, during the last couple of years of the Herbert Walker Bush administration and the 8 years of the Clinton administration, same thing. Big bathtub occurred. We drained down intelligence, and we paid the penalty on 9/11. Pulled down on our military capabilities, let the infrastructure go to the blazes. Dwight Eisenhower was right. It's peace through strength, and we need to recognize that the world we live in requires some leadership, and it requires some investment in our military capabilities. And the problem of our debt is in entitlements. It is not in the defense budget. There's no way in the world you could balance this budget, these debts, solve the debt problem and the deficit problem off the Department of Defense. Now, that said, is it possible to cut something out of the Department of Defense? And of course it is. My goodness, any big bureaucracy has waste. The Congress stuffs $10 billion a year down the Defense Department's throat that the Defense Department doesn't even want. It's for stuff that has nothing to do with our national security. The other things, the same things, the entitlements, but we're going to have to at some point look at how much are people in the military paying for their health care when they retire. And you look at that, and we have to begin to connect the user and the provider of health care together so that they make rational decisions. And there's penalties for lack of productivity in that industry. Now, are there other things that can be done in the Department of Defense? Sure. If I were involved, which I'm not, I think what you do is you get 3 or 4 of the recent controllers of the Department of Defense, sit them down, Republican and Democrat, and have them just kind of air what they see as things that can be fixed. But there's money that can be saved there. But I think it's a fool's errand if people think they can. The debt is terrible. The deficit is outrageous. It's damaging to this country. It's damaging to the credibility of the United States of America. And it has to be addressed. And there's a reluctance to address it, but it has to be addressed through entitlements, in my view. And anyone who starts chasing after the Pentagon thinking that they're going to solve the trillions of dollars of deficit and debt that's being accrued simply are going to be disappointed because the money's just not there.
Mr. Secretary, in your book you speak about unknown unknowns and known unknowns, and I would submit that a known known is that through your lifetime of public service in our country, we have all been benefited. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight.